Today we are talking about functions and theories of religion. But it's important to note that when we're looking at religion, we are looking at thoughts and beliefs and behaviors. We're looking also at the way that religion sort of reflects people's larger beliefs about the world. And it's important that many societies will actually have religious belief systems that kind of mirror their larger worldview. So, for example, if you are in a very stratified society, such as the ancient Egyptians, their religious worlds also featured a hierarchy of gods, and people had different levels of access to those gods depending on who they were in society. So the Pharaoh was actually a manifestation of God, was a God here on earth. And it's one of the reasons why pharaohs actually would ritually shave their entire bodies, including their eyebrows, and then draw them back on with kohl, which is like an oily kind of pigment. And the priest class were the highest class and the only people who could read and write. And only the pharaoh had these kind of elaborate, massive burials vis-a-vis the pyramids and so on. And so that was a very unequal, stratified society, which also is reflected in their religious practice. Likewise, you can look at a more egalitarian group, such as the San, who we will talk about a lot this semester, and they have a very egalitarian, very equal society. And everyone has access to all the gods. So anyone can be inhabited by the gods, anyone can call upon them for help. They don't have a priest class that kind of limits and restricts access to religious belief and practice. And so all of that kind of reflects different people's cosmologies of belief. And we're going to really talk about sort of the functions of religion, so the purpose that religion serves in different communities, and also some theories that anthropologists have come up with for why different types of religious practice and belief exist. Functions and theories of religion, let's explore that now. So anthropologists believe that there are kind of five main functions of religion. And first, we can think about religion as this explanation of the world. So why things happen, how they happen, when they happened, all of that kind of thing. And collectively, we call that a cosmology or worldview. So it's people's beliefs about the origins of the world, the gods and spirits that exist in the world, the spirits or forces and how they exert pressures on the world, and then the relationships to humans there and in the spirit realm. Second is religion as a source of healing. So religion can be healing quite literally. And in fact, this week we'll be reading about ritual healing theory. And it's this idea that religion gives people a sense of spiritual kind of control over the world, but it also gives them emotional support and a sense of release or a sense of healing. So there are, of course, religious healing practices, which we'll talk about later on in the semester, but it also gives them a sense of kind of emotional support. That emotional support is also, of course, part of social cohesion. So your church, your congregation, your religious community, your ritual community, they function as an extension of the family or sometimes even a replacement for the family. And it brings people together in this collective sense. Religion is also a tool of social control. So on one hand, it brings people together, but on the other hand, it is a handy dandy tool to make people do what you want, whether it is threatening them with being kicked out of a religious community, which is what excommunication was all about, or whether it was the fear that if you went against your king, your queen, your whoever your ruler was, you would then be condemned to suffering through their magic or otherwise, which was how ancient Nepalese rulers were in Nepal. They were actually gods, right? And going against the king was going against God. And so that's a great way to, control people, make them do what you want. It's also, of course, an economic strategy. So it leads to things like leveling mechanisms, which is when the leadership has a way to collect all of the wealth and then redistribute it. So in smaller scale societies, that typically is very egalitarian. in larger scale societies, we see that through things like taxation, which may or may not be more egalitarian. So it's this kind of way to prevent people from hoarding all the wealth, but it also uses the religion as a way to collect economic resources and then redistribute them to the other people in the religious group, such as tithes and offerings are in modern day Christianity. So that's the function. Let's talk about some of the theories of religion. So the ones we're going to focus on today are this notion of the evolutionary theory for why religion exists, the Marxist theory for why religion exists, and then a functionalist theory, which is really going to be the one we focus on the most this semester. Let's talk about the theory of evolution. So the theory of evolution, of course, is this notion that species adapt over time, and they adapt according to environmental pressures that affect them. Right? And evolution, which has been largely accepted across the scientific community and observed through scientific methods, knows that most cultural beliefs in humans may or may not have some root in evolution, meaning that some of the beliefs that we have seem to have evolved as a way to protect us. So for example, our culture, we wear clothing to help protect against the environment. We build buildings so that we can live everywhere from the North Pole to, well, okay, not literally the North Pole, but the subarctic to the deserts, right? And we've used our culture to adapt to these different regions. So the question is, in anthropology, is there an adaptive force to religion? Is there a reason why religion exists? And did it help human survival and therefore create this kind of susceptibility to this kind of belief system? And it's often linked to, human creativity and that kind of thing. And so that could quite be a possibility. And in fact, ritual healing theory, which I just mentioned, shows that when people believe that they are being healed through supernatural means, through prayer, through laying of hands, the idea is that that belief then calms the stress response, the parasympathetic nervous system, and actually can help the person recover from a basic thing like a cold, for example. Now, of course, religion is not going to heal you from cancer, but it can make the self-reported outcome of the person's feelings, it can make them feel better. And that stress response in, illnesses that would have resolved themselves anyway, like at the common cold, may have some kind of link to this belief in religion. Similarly, there's this idea of cleanliness rituals. So a lot of religions have cleanliness rituals, which are very literal, oftentimes washing of the hands, washing of the feet, washing before eating, those kinds of things. And that may have had some kind of protective measure in sickness. And so that could have been sort of selected for in that regard. So that's kind of the evolutionary idea, like that religion actually may have had some kind of benefit in our evolutionary path, starting maybe even as early as Homo erectus, pre-modern humans, right, and going forward. Now, the problem with evolutionary theory is that in its earliest days, anthropology was very problematic. And evolution was applied to people's culture, not so much in this idea that culture helps you evolve and thrive, but there was this idea that cultural evolution was linear. There was a trajectory, and that you could look at the belief system that a culture had to determine if they were quote unquote primitive versus evolved, right? And because of the ethnocentrism, AKA racism of the day, Christian monotheism was believed to be the most logical religion of all, and polytheistic religions, or pretty much anything that non-white people believed in, was considered to be primitive. And this was kind of deeply embedded in this notion of progress and primitivism and cultural evolution. And so these early kind of evolutionary anthropologists use evolution to prove that Christianity is the most evolved of all. And here's two of those racist guys there, a bunch of, we're gonna be talking about a lot of old dead white men and women in this coming weeks. But they had some really important influences on our understandings of religion insofar as they did talk about things like animism and animatism. So that aspect of their research was at least not so problematic. So Edward Tyler is the famous anthropologist who concluded that every group in the world had belief systems in spiritual and supernatural beings. And he was correct in identifying that religion was a human universal. And he took it into a kind of an unfortunate direction in that, primitive beliefs were evidenced in the fact that they thought that non-human animals and objects or plants and so on could have souls, right? So he comes up with this idea of animism, which we've already talked about as being this idea that everything is animated with an essence or soul. And he thought that the only rational evolutionary chain was for people to only conclude that humans alone had souls. And it was a mark of primitivism if you thought that other objects might have a soul, right? So again, there's that ethnocentrism coming out, using evolution as their kind of basis. Now, influenced by Tyler, this guy, Robert Merritt, he takes the concept of animism and he recognized that, animism was certainly very common, but also there was such a thing that he called animatism. And this was this idea that, it's not always about a soul, right? Sometimes it's impersonal, sometimes it's disembodied, meaning that it's not always rooted in like an object or a plant or an animal or a person. So he had this idea that animatism, this belief in fate, luck, misfortune, destiny, was rooted to people's beliefs and desires in having control over things like nature, weather, famine, etc. And so these two men, their best legacy is this notion of animism and animatism, which we still utilize today. But of course, their worst legacy is that they thought that they could also use this to prove that people who believed in more than one God were somehow more primitive than people who only believed in one God. So today, fortunately, evolutionary theory is very different. Nobody kind of looks at it in terms of this trajectory that all human groups are on, right? Instead, they understand that there's a massive historical change in religion over time, and that belief systems are influenced by environment. So they're more interested in looking at sort of the origins of where religion begins, that ritual healing theory that I just talked about, and they care about historical change over time. A really great example of evolutionary theory applied to religion is to look at something like the Inuits and their example of the afterlife, adluvun, right? So the Inuit are people who live in northern Canada and Alaska, and they are the indigenous people there. And interestingly enough, their version of adluvun, of the afterlife, is a frozen cold wasteland under the sea. Now, adluvun is sort of similar to hell. It's not really hell in that it's not eternal, actually. So it's a very unique, but it's kind of a negative place that people hang out in, the soul hangs out in after death. And so adluvun is this wasteland under the sea. It's where the sun never shines and where it's completely barren of animals. And people's souls get trapped there for about a year after they can move on to the land of the moon, which is where they find peaceful rest. And pictured on the right, this is the goddess Sedna, who is the goddess of the sea and the underworld. And she created all the sea creatures of the world from her hair and fingers. So that's what these little porpoises and dolphins are, and that narwhal coming out of her hair there. And so she lives, that's her domain, this domain of creation, right? But from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense that people would create their notion of hell out of their environmental experience, right? So first of all, it's super cold. It's not a lake of fire. It's not hot. Second of all, it's a place where it's eternally dark and there's no sun, no sea creatures to feast on, and it's under the ocean, right? Under the water, deep within the sea. And so for them, that mirrors their cycle of life, right? So for them, they have very harsh winters where it's very dark, and the animals the migrating animals, many of them leave. And so, they can still get their sea lions and so on, but it's a little more difficult for them. And so for them, it's basically eternal winter with no food but under the ocean. And so these harsh winters in the Arctic always give rise to light, right? Then it becomes, it's very abundant. The sun is out all day long in the Arctic. And so in the subarctic in particular. And so just like Adlevon, that is a temporary state of being. And so too is their afterlife. So this is a really nice example of how an evolutionary theory kind of approaches where these notions of the afterlife of Adlevon specifically come from. So switching gears, let's talk about Marxist theories of religion. So Karl Marx, that's the gentleman sitting here, another old dead white guy, angry old dead white guy, this one. He was famous for religion being the opiate of the masses, right? That's his famous term. And so he didn't care about logic or rationality. He didn't really care about ethnocentrism. He recognized the controlling aspect of religion. And he took a kind of a step further in that, saying that all of religion exists as distraction. So a distraction from exploitation on life, right? So it was a way for the religious classes to work in cahoots with the elite business owners as a way to control people so that they'd be willing to suffer and work through their own exploitation because there's a reward waiting for them in the afterlife. And so he saw religion as fundamentally oppressive, and you obey God just as you obey your boss, right? You obey in order to have some kind of reward at the end of life. And so it was a justification for the mistreatment of the working class, which he called the proletariat. Now, Marxist theory of religion is one of the reasons why we saw later communist countries, such as China and Russia, they kind of disbanded religion, but they were very suspicious of religious belief and disallowed a lot of religious behavior and activity from being a major part of daily life, kind of taking from this early Marxist kind of ideology that it would be not just an exploitative process, but also that it was a distraction from the state, right? And loyalty to the state. So interesting kind of legacy there with Marxist theory and religion. So finally, let's talk about functionalist theory and religion, because that's the thing we're going to be really focusing on this semester. So functionalism is the idea that everything has a function in society, and religion can be sort of deconstructed to look at what purpose it serves as it relates to human social needs, right? So evolution cares about environment. Marxism is all about this as being kind of a trick of exploitation. Functionalism says, okay, what purpose does it serve that helps the society operate together? So it's not just about kind of survival and adaptation to the environment, but it's more about what brings people together and what role it plays to sort of ensure that societies operate smoothly. So with functionalism, they believe that religious beliefs serve an actual purpose, and they're not just randomly generated. So it at one time served an important human need, and we just may not be able to see what that need is today, especially if it's a very old religion. So a functionalist could think of something like Christianity and this idea of eternal life as serving a very important purpose of assuaging people's fears about death and the eternity of death, for example, right? That would be a functionalist way. It makes people feel secure and safe and certain about what will happen to them after death. And that goes with many religions, not just Christianity, obviously. So these are a couple more important people that we should think about. So Durkheim, Radcliffe Brown, and Bronislaw Malinowski. So Emil Durkheim's actually a sociologist, and he was all about this notion of collective consciousness, which unifies society. And so what he means by that is he thinks, religion kind of serves to keep people in line from this functionalist perspective. And when I say keep them in line, I'm not talking about the Marxist, like, you have to do your job. It's more like it gives people a role in their society and gives them a sense of purpose that then makes them continue to behave in the way they need to behave for their particular role in that society. And, you know, for him, if everyone gave into kind of individualistic selfishness, then there'd be chaos, right? And so religion can help kind of control the chaos a bit. Radcliffe Brown, he had this idea that religion actually promoted emotional attachment. So it gave people a sense of emotional attachment to one another, and it gave them a reason to care about one another in their religious group. And so he really talked about kind of the emotions and the way that you know, that ritual and symbol and those kinds of things gave people an emotional kind of connection to one another within their religious group. Now, Malinowski, he's someone that we're going to actually talk about a little bit more this semester because he has some really important contributions. And for him, his basic premise was that religion fulfills basic human needs, primarily the need to explain things that people have no control over. So he kind of takes a page from Tyler and Merritt's book, in that religion helps people feel a sense of control over the elements, for example. And it's a way for people to, who need a sense of kind of rationality, it's a way for them to rationalize things that don't always make sense, right? So it's very comforting in that way. And so religion can kind of help them figure out why they may have been seemingly singled out for some calamitous occasion. And it provides them with emotional comfort and a sense of control. So using things like magic to control the elements, or to give them a sense of security in a world that can be very insecure, right? So functionalism is all about creating social relationships and figuring what the purpose of these ancient traditions was. And these are kind of the main theoretical contributions that have existed to explain why religion kind of functions the way it does, and the importance of kind of trying to understand not only the purpose, but theories for why and how and when and where these kinds of things adapted. And we can look at evolution, we can look at kind of a Marxist analysis, or we can look at a functionalist analysis to figure that out. And for this class, we'll be mostly focusing on functionalism from now on.